It's really great to be able to be back together again like this. And Job 38 is our focus for this evening. Actually, several chapters here, but we're going to focus initially, at least, in Job 38. And we've taken a little time off with Easter for one thing, but also even just all the challenges recently. We haven't maybe looked at Job a whole lot in the last little bit, but I want to focus on it again yet this evening, maybe just one more time after tonight. But let's look at Job 38. Of course, we looked at Job's trials and frustration and even depression. We looked also at Job's confidence and the truths that kind of held him fast. And there's a lot of good to be found there. But I want to focus this evening on, actually we could maybe begin with verse 1. And I want to just call your attention to a little something there. In Job 38, verse 1, it says, "Then the Lord answered Job." Then the Lord answered Job. For all these other chapters, we don't know, months, maybe a year. We don't know how long this has been, but it's gone on quite some time that Job has been looking for God. He wants God to show up. He wants God to come through for him. But in the midst of all of that, it seemed as though he couldn't find him. Remember, it said that he looked in front, he looked behind, he looked to the right and left hands, and he couldn't find God anywhere. Now, his confidence still came through. Remember, he said, "But he knoweth the way that I take." So, in other words, I know God knows what's going on, even though I can't see him. And yet, in a sense, we would almost feel like Job is probably saying, "Lord, please show up for me. My so-called comforters are here giving me such a terrible time. And Lord, would you just come set the record straight?" And finally, in verse number 1 of chapter 38, God does. "Then the Lord answered Job." But if we're really honest, when we start reading a little further and even over the next few chapters, it doesn't exactly look like what Job probably was expecting. If he's saying, "Lord, please show up for me," he's probably not saying, "Would you come and speak just what these chapters say?" One example of that is verse 4. That's our text verse tonight, but it's really just a springboard for all the rest of them. God speaks up and he says in verse 4, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding." So really what happens is Job is hoping for God to show up, and when he does, then God says, "Hey Job, where have you been? When you thought you have everything all put together, how is it that it seems as though you can't get this straight? Where were you when I created the world?" Obviously, it's a rhetorical question. There's no answer for that. Job knows I wasn't anywhere around. Now, Job is an old book. Obviously, Moses' writings about creation, all that would have come first. But as far as the writings themselves probably were after Job wrote, even though Adam lived before Job. So this is a very old book. But Job was still far enough removed, he'd have to say, "Lord, I wasn't anywhere around." And God continues, and just it's question after question, and kind of pointing out here to Job, you're really very inferior to me. When you thought you had the answers, who really did, Job? Who really had this all worked out when you thought that you knew what was supposed to be happening? And so Job has to sort of, actually if you look at chapter 40, I believe it is, he says, "I have to just put my hand over my mouth. I can't even talk. I have nothing to say. I know I was too arrogant." And so even though I've told you before, I'll say it again, I believe Job was righteous throughout this time. And yet even righteous Job could struggle a little bit with those feelings that somehow this is not the way it's supposed to happen. This is not right. Surely God's forgotten me. And God says, "Wait a minute, Job, I've been there the whole time. I always was. I am right now. I will be forever." And by the way, that applies to you and me too. In other words, God is for us. He was in our past. He is in our present. He will be in our future. The same God who was alive for Job is alive for us. Elihu made one statement there back in chapter 37 which Elihu is one of he's the fourth friend, and some have different ideas maybe about him, and maybe would think that he either, maybe they would say, well, I think he's just sort of foolish, he's just also arrogant, he thinks he has the answers. He was apparently a young man, and he waited until the others spoke up. But from what I'm reading, I see that it makes sense to me. And he kind of was getting after Job a little bit for his arrogance and maybe self-pity, maybe a little bit too self-confident. And so Elihu talks about that. But over in chapter 37, let me just share that with you here as well, where Elihu mentions how even with the weather, God is in control. And verse 12, it's turned around by his counsels, that they may do whatsoever he commandeth them upon the face of the world and the earth. He causeth it to come, talking about the rain, whether for correction or for his land or for mercy. We'll talk about that again in just a little bit. But Elihu is saying God's the one that controls all this. And sometimes it's just good for us to maybe recognize a little bit like Job, I don't have all the answers. This is not all put together quite like I would maybe have thought I had it put together. And I need to just recognize my true size. And God gives a number of questions here in chapter 38 for one place, but then even 39, 40, 41, he continues to give some questions to Job. Doesn't need an answer. It's just sort of saying, Job, just remember this. Where were you? In verse 4, when I laid the foundation of the earth. That creation, where were you? Other places like verse 11, he talks about the waves. Do you understand why the waves don't come overthrowing the shore? Why do they stop at the edge? Why do they just come to the shore and that's as far as they come? Do you understand that, Job? What about maybe down in verse 22, hast thou considered or entered into the treasures of the snow? Or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail? You got all that down pat? You got science figured out there, Job? Do you know where snow comes from? Do you understand how that works? What about hail? Ice, even whenever it's warm. Things of that sort. Do you understand that? How are all the animals fed? That's down at the very last of that chapter. It talks about the lion. Wilt thou hunt the prey for the lion? Fulfill the appetite of the young lions. Mentions also the raven in verse 41. Do you understand how they're fed? What about all those animals, Job? Again, Job has no answer. Furthermore, he talks about the peacock and the ostrich. Can you explain and do you understand all the beauties of the peacock? Do you recognize even the carelessness of the ostrich with her eggs? That's in 39 verses 13 through 17. Then in chapter 40, then he mentions one that we still sometimes may discuss today, is Behemoth. What is that? And God may say, do you comprehend or do you recognize who created Behemoth? For our day, we might be faced with questions like, well, was it a dinosaur? Was it a rhinoceros? Was it this or that? We don't have all the answers. Then he goes, even in chapter 41, he talks about Leviathan. What was Leviathan? Job, do you understand about Leviathan? Apparently way, way larger than any man. And somehow a sea creature. We don't know exactly. There's maybe sometimes thoughts of dragons or whatever else. You read about verse 20 and 21. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. Okay, well, Job, you understand all that? I don't understand it. I'll be honest with you about that. I don't know what all is talked about here. But God just gives a series of questions and saying, Job, recognize I'm the creator. I'm the one who's in charge of it all. You can trust me. William Beebe was a naturalist back in Theodore Roosevelt's time. And I'm not sure if it was actually during Roosevelt's presidency or not. But anyway, they would go out on the lawn at night, I guess just as it would be getting dusk. And as they would go out there and they'd be watching as the sky darkened and that first pinpoint of light or whatever. And so Roosevelt maybe they shared that type of experience. But in the one case I read of, Roosevelt would say, oh, you see that? See that star there? That point of light, and then he'd start explaining. He'd recite how that's the spiral galaxy in Andromeda, way out there. Then he continues something like this. It is as large as our Milky Way. It is one of 100 million galaxies. It consists of 100 billion suns, each larger than our own sun. And then he would grin and say, I think we are small enough. Let's go to bed. And I've experienced somewhat similar situation too as we visited a few years ago, right around this time. It was would have been during our time at the IH convention there in Dayton, which it'd be happening this next week, apart from the virus and all. And so right around this time, we went there, and they had a display of some sort for, I think, sort of in an IMAX type of setting, and they would show the different parts of God's creation and zoomed way into the distant galaxies or whatever. And well, I really caught the significance of it when they started to kind of, I don't know what the right terminology would be, but sort of like zoom back into our own world and how long it took just to zoom quickly back to our place and to recognize we're on earth and we're just one person on earth and how small we are in God's great creation. And sometimes we just need a little bit of that reminder to, as I want to focus tonight, to get down to our true size. And so tonight, let's just look at that for a few moments. I know I've spent a while already just preparing the way, but I want to talk to you about our true size. And to recognize how great God is and how small I am, how He is still in control. He's still on the throne. He still knows all about us. He's able to solve our every problem. Maybe the very first place we'd want to start is just to recognize His authority. We serve a God who created it all. We serve a God who's still in heaven. He's on the throne. He still is far above all creatures. Yes, that includes Satan. Yes, that includes all the demons. Yes, that includes anyone that may come against you. His authority is infinite. It always was. It is today. It always will be. He is still in control. He knows exactly what we need. He knows exactly how to step in and solve our problem. His authority is still above all. Sometimes we can almost get that feeling like maybe He's not in control because it's not working out for me. Maybe I think that because my problems get pretty heavy to handle, because when I prayed it didn't seem like it worked out right, that we almost get the idea that, well, God must not be in control anymore. No, He's far above it all. He knows exactly how to solve our problem. His authority is big enough, but sometimes we seem to want to rise on our pedestal and we want everybody to think we've got a handle on this. We're in control. No. It's far from that. Even when Job, trying to serve God, but when Job even started to get the idea that maybe he knew how this is all supposed to work out, God could step in and say, Job, let me just talk to you a little bit. Let me just tell you a little bit about what you don't know. Oh, so often we seem to have a hard time getting humble enough to really, truly appreciate the power and majesty of our God. He is great, and we are small. He is strong, and we are weak. He is able when we are unable. Job obviously didn't have a very pleasant situation. We've talked about that in the past. But even in the face of opposition, maybe his response to that got him a little too much self-pity, a little bit too much self-confidence, maybe we'd say, or self-importance. And he just kind of needed a reminder of who God is and how great He is. And when God spoke up, Job got quiet, even ashamed if you read Job 40 and verse number 3. Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay mine hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. I'm done talking. I see my error. I recognize when I thought I had this understood and it's figured out, I'm just insignificant and weak. I don't have the knowledge. And so maybe we need to just take some time, fairly often maybe, to just say, Lord, show me a little more of you so I see how small I am. Show me a little more of your glory, Lord, so that I can take my rightful place. My place of humility. Again, God's authority is infinite and we are no match for Him. Not that we'd be trying to compete with Him, but if we're not careful sometimes in all that goes on in our lives, it's almost as though we feel like we're the ones responsible. But it's not about us, it's about Him. As I mentioned a little bit ago, God was there, He is there, and He will be there for eternity, no matter how turbulent things may seem. Again, I mentioned to you just back here some of Elihu's comments in chapter 37, how he was talking about the weather and how God is even in charge of that. He has a reason for what He brings or allows. And He gives even rain and storms for a purpose. We may not understand them, and one person may be praying, well, Lord, the fact is, I remember years ago, a lady that attended a church that we were at, and she just simply said in her unique way, you know, one wants it this way, one wants it that way, and she just said, poor Jesus, He don't know what to do. And in a sense, that's about the way it is. If we all got what we wanted, nobody'd have what they wanted, really. I mean, we'd have to live in a bubble. Because my neighbor right over here might want heavy rain. And my neighbor right over here doesn't want any rain. And this one might want snow. And that one wants who knows what. It goes on and on and on. And yet God has a purpose. He gives the rain or storms for a purpose, like is mentioned there in verse number 13. Yes, verse 13. He causeth it to come, whether for correction or for His land or for mercy. Correction, it carries the idea of the rod of correction, and we might even think this is actually the rod of judgment, but sort of on the same idea where He used the flood, Noah's flood, to wipe them out. He can do that for correction. He can bring about even disaster for His glory. Then He also mentions there about for His land, and even just to revive the ground. He can send the rain for that purpose. He can send it in mercy and the times of refreshing for the barren and all those things. God's authority is still in full display, even in the weather. He's still in charge. Not only that, but let's quickly move on to the second aspect, and that is that God's abundance is sufficient. God's abundance is sufficient. You know, men can sometimes think that they're the one that's kind of in charge. They're the provider. They're the one to make ends meet. They're the ones to do whatever needs done for their family. And we have an obligation there, but we need to be careful that we don't start getting in our minds that we're the ones responsible for all this. That we made it happen. Almost the idea of the age-old concept of a self-made man. We are not at all self-made. And sometimes we just need to step back and say, all right, Lord, You're in charge. It's Your abundance. It's Your provision. God feeds the animals. We read about, or told you about that earlier. He provides for billions of creatures, I suppose. Maybe more than that. I don't know the numbers, but maybe trillions or more. All the creatures, great or small, He provides for them. But then He's also the one who's responsible for you and me. Remember how Jesus said about how the sparrow even can find their food? He said, if God takes care of the sparrows, don't you think He'll take care of you? Well, sure He will. He is the provider. His abundance is sufficient. It's never diminished. I think on your bulletin today, if you had taken a look at that one, no, it's not in maybe the most convenient format for you to read, but if you took a look at the quotes there, one said something along this line that sometimes on the outward display, we may act like we've got it all taken care of it, and we're calm and cool and collected, you know. That's the idea. When inside, we might be panicked. We don't know what to do. How am I going to get through this? And yet through all of that, our real source of confidence ought to be in our abundant Savior, the one who pours out all the blessings that we need. Job needed to see God's authority in the midst of his pain. But he also needed a little reminder that God was able to provide in any way He chose for any problem that he met. Whatever Job went through, whatever he was blinded to as far as God's working at the time, we talked about that, how he couldn't find God, looking in front and behind and all around him, he couldn't find Him. When he was blinded to what God was doing, God was still plenty able. God was still in charge. And you and I can get a little too puffed up until we just sense a little more our need of the heavenly provider. When we recognize I can't do this by myself. And obviously we've got all kinds of things going on right now. And whether you get the relief check or you get your job back or whatever it may be in the form of what would seem to be a provision, God is still our provider. God is still abundantly able. We can trust Him. We can look to Him for help. Sometimes we just need to get down off our high horse and say, Lord, help me to be small enough that I can enjoy and appreciate Your greatness. May I really have Your blessing. Maybe sometimes we ought to just read these four chapters, 38, 39, 40, 41. Maybe you don't even want to go to 42 because it's a little more enjoyable maybe in some ways. But especially these chapters to just remind us how small we are and get us down to the right size. God's abundance is sufficient. One more that I want to mention to you, or maybe I shouldn't say want, I think we ought to. It may not be something we like to discuss very much. But sometimes we need to remember all about the other aspect of God stepping in here for Job. Remember how Job maybe, I think we've already mentioned about it, but Job would have felt like, I wish God would show up for me. But we need to remember that when God shows up, He knows perfectly every part of our lives. And so once in a while when we say, oh Lord, please show up, if He shows up, He might have some cautions for us. He might have, could I even say, accusations to us. And so let me give you this third one that I would refer to it maybe this way. His accusations are perfect. In other words, when God starts speaking, when the God of heaven who knows everything about us begins to probe into our lives, His accusations, His discipline to us, His pinpointing the problem is exactly perfect. He knows every part about you. He knows every part about me. And when I say, oh Lord, show up to show my enemies, maybe I better be careful because I need to recognize when God shows up, He knows exactly where to pinpoint my problems too. And so sometimes He might just give me a few questions. Say, wait a minute now, what about this? And what about that? And where were you? And what were you thinking? And what did you say? On and on. His questions could go to us. And so God can deal with us perfectly, even in accusation sometimes, even when He has to start bringing discipline. And God is overall in those areas as well. Job had all these chapters of self-justification, but when God spoke, Job saw the reality of it. Job saw what he was saying. He was pretty much brought to silence. Yeah, he'd had a lot of complaints and a lot of self-pity until God stepped in. But when God started speaking, Job recognized how small he was. Overall, we do recognize Job was righteous. And yet even Job needed God to work on him. And please, don't start trying to self-justify so much that you think you can't be worked on. Because when God starts speaking honestly to our hearts, we have some areas to work on. Say, oh, no, not me. I don't have these blind spots. I could see them in other people, but, other people probably can see them in you. We all have issues where we need God. Maybe you wouldn't want to use the word accuse, but where God just faithfully deals with us. He's perfect. And we need to get down to the point of humility where God can start speaking. And where God can start saying, now, maybe it's not Job, obviously in your case, but maybe he calls your name. Now, what about this? What about that? You and I ought to let God take us down to size. When we start feeling a little bit too self-confident, when we get a little too high an opinion of ourselves, you know what we need to do? We need to let Him stack us up or put us up to the pattern of Jesus. How do we measure up? Where do I come on that pattern? Am I really being what God wants me to be? And it'll take us pretty much down to size pretty quickly. And so tonight, as we bring the message to a close, again, if Job, and he was, the Bible calls him a perfect and upright man, one who feared God and eschewed evil. If God could work on Job, if God had a few questions for Job that just put him to silence, don't you think that He also can do the same for you and for me? Don't you think He can work on us? Surely we have some things that God could work on. And so let's just ask Him even this week to make Himself real to us. Let's just ask Him, Lord, would you just get me down to size? Would you make me really what I ought to be? Would you help me to really recognize where I've fallen short? Even though I might put myself up here on a pedestal. Lord, would you somehow work on me? If you could work on Job, would you work on me too? Oh, that God would help us to get down to size so that He can be exalted to greatness. That's what He deserves in every one of our lives. And this week, I want you to focus on that. I want you to ask God to help you to get down before Him in humility and honesty, a genuineness about you, down to where you belong. Well, you go with God this week and trust that He'll be with you and speak to your hearts. Stir you and stir me. We might meditate on His greatness.